Now a little overview of some related topics, Flexbox, the idea of layout in general, and something we haven't talked about much at all, and frankly we won't. You do entire courses on the idea of what are our objectives in the design as we put things together. So floating. Before we talk about Flexbox, we'll talk about floating, layout, multi-column layout, gallery pages, things like that. They've gone through a bunch of transitions. In the old dark pre-CSS days, we used big tables to do them. They're rigid. Recent years, we use floats to arrange these items. Sometimes these pages were fixed using pixel sizes. Later, we developed percentage-based floating systems. But floating was never made for this purpose. It was made for what we should use it for, which is taking individual items and floating it into text, have text run around it. It took a lot of extra code for us to float things together in a gallery and have it actually be responsive. It took a lot of work. So we're gradually moving past that. Today, many pages still do use floating, but two exciting technologies, new technologies make layout easier, more flexible, more responsive, more intuitive. Flexbox, actually I guess you could say it's three, Flexbox, Grid, and multi-column. Grid relates more to the overall layout. Multi-column relates just to that one thing, handling multiple columns, usually of text and headings. So, what are these things? There's been some discussion of these already a little bit, but now we're really moving into Flexbox. Flexbox is officially known as CSS Flexbox Flexible Box Layout. It creates a great way to lay out nav menus, galleries, and more. It allows easy centering. Centering was always one of our big hang-ups with floating, and with lots of other, we always have these tricks to center things, like we size it and then we use a certain margins to center it, or use equal percentage margins to center something. But that's one of the fantastic things about Flexbox, is how easy it is to center things, and also to stretch groups of things to fill space, to change order. We can center things top, bottom, left, right, so it works on different axes. There's a lot to Flexbox. You'll need to know how to use at least the basic features of Flexbox. Chances are you will use Flexbox in your navigation, and if you do a gallery on your site for your samples page, for instance, you'll probably use it there. It doesn't replace floating for normal use of single images, for instance, floated in text, perhaps with a caption. Grid and multi-column, here's definitions for those. Grid, which is the grid layout module, allows overall page layout in rows and columns using an underlying grid. So it's table-like in that way, but it's a lot more complicated, powerful, and flexible. We won't be using this, but you can do extra credit, as I suggested last week with this. You should read about it at least. It's probably the future of layout. It's gradually being supported by more browsers. It's not completely there yet, perhaps, but it's very interesting. Multi-column, I think it's a bit more specific in its use. Set numbers of columns, widths, gaps between them, and so on. Again, gradually becoming more supported by browsers. And again, you could do extra credit with it if you wish. Okay, so let's talk specifically about Flexbox, as we're about to go into a Flexbox demo in probably the next presentation. So we use CSS to call something a flex container by using a display flex on it. So usually this thing is a div that usually then we put a hashtag on, and we say display flex. We start the flexing, and then we tell it the direction. Possible values are row, column, row reverse, column reverse. We'll look at that again in a demo. Every Flexbox has a main axis and a cross axis, which is a little hard to get your head around, but usually we just think of as the row, which is we flex across, sort of like left to right, sort of horizontally. But the cross axis would be a vertical axis. You'll need to know about flex wrap. No wrap is the default, but we tell it a wrap or wrap reverse. Do the item squish or break into additional lines. That's what that comes down to. You'll need to know about FlexFlow, which is shorthand for direction and wrap together. You put those things together. Justify content is for sure one you're going to use. How is the extra space arranged? You've got a group of items. They're flexing together on a line or maybe in multiple lines, but there's always extra space left over, right? Okay. Is it going to go is the stuff going to be centered? Are you going to add that space all around them? Are you going to put the space on the ends? So that's justify content. And then there's some more properties. You can align individual items and align self. You read about these. And a lot more flex order and aligning stuff going on. See how we use margins and auto with flex in a container on page 432, because I believe that's going to particularly work in the navigation example. And now, okay, so that's Flexbox. Just a quick overview, and we'll use it in a demo a little later. About design, I like to think about overall ideas about design, and hopefully you'll have some ideas in your resume. With these principles, we call these the CRAP principles, and you may have seen these I think these work in print, they work in the web, they work in so many ways. These features here, these big ideas, contrast, repetition, alignment, proximity. I think it's useful to think about those with your resume and with anything that you do, and make sure there's some logic behind all these. And this is how we break down design. Contrast. So things that are different should really be different, in other words. So it's nice to have lots of different shapes. So you might have some things that are verticals and some things that are horizontals, for instance, on your page, blocks of things, right? When things are different size, we set up a hierarchy of them. So example is your headings, right? You don't want your H1 to be really close in size to your H2 and be really close in size to your H3. You make them distinctly different. We set up contrast, lets us set up hierarchy, gives us a variety. Hierarchy of headings, for instance, is a good example. Likewise, with contrast of size of images. We really like to have a big difference between the dominant image and then as compared to the next biggest image. Usually the size difference is at least 2 to 1. So contrast in color, perhaps. We certainly want to see that in our links. So contrast is an extremely important feature in all your web work and design work in general. Repetition brings consistency. It really helps people get used to the way we use things. If a H2 is a certain color, it's probably always that color unless it's doing some other job, right? We like to use the same kind of direction, the same kind of, the navigation repeats in the same style on every page. We tend to use the same fonts, or maybe in just a single font throughout. Colors are used for the same purposes. Headers are used for the same purposes. So repetition brings consistency and helps people understand how the site works. Alignment. We really like things to line up, but if they don't line up, we really like them to be really not lined up. But as this example shows, when elements are nearly lined up, they look odd, right? So we usually stick with one text alignment, for instance. That's one way to look at this, and it's usually a line left. But there might be one thing that's different, which might be centered, which might be a certain heading, for instance. So alignment is definitely an issue. And proximity is the one that you can have a lot of control over, for instance, with the box model. We really want to feel like that heading and the paragraphs that follow it, that they really, if they go together, they should be a little closer together. Or better yet, that they should be separated from the things that they don't go with. So we use white space to say that things that are different are separated, okay? And things that go together are pulled together. We use margins and padding for this. You use the box model because if you don't do some of these changes on your website with proximity, it kind of feels like your HTML just all kind of flows together and everything is kind of like equally spaced all around. You want to make sure there's chunks of stuff. And don't be afraid of using extra white space. So I think it's useful to take a website, and let's just take, I don't know, this one first, and just sort of look at how those ideas are applied, right? And I'm just going to scroll down a little bit to this area of this website. Okay, so contrast, we definitely see the contrast in the color of the heading, main heading with a secondary kind of heading-like paragraph, right? But yet we see the same use in the logo. This is the same color, repetition of color there, contrast of color there, contrast in sizing, big size, contrast in bolding, bold and unbold. Yet we still feel like this stuff kind of holds together, right? And it's separate from the things that are going to follow it. The space here is enormous between those things, right? Still feel like things hold together and are separate from the things that they don't go with. So that's one idea. We have repetition, we have proximity being used, we have contrast being used for sure. The alignment is pretty basic. It's just everything is aligned along this edge here, but it's obviously separate from the map that's over here. All right, I'm just going to look at one more. You could do this with any website, and it doesn't mean that everything's good. You could say why things don't work in some ways, perhaps. I'll use this one. Who knows why? This is like a coffee website or something. I don't know sure why I picked it. But the idea of things, when we put things in, this is almost like a chunk of card. We call these cards kind of. They're kind of like business cards sort of setup. It really makes alignment and changes in shape. So we have vertical, we have horizontals, yet we have the repetition of those fonts, yet the font themselves, it represents the fonts and the capitalization, yet we have the size difference between the label and the topic kind of. I think this presents a really neat idea of contrast and repetition and alignment and proximity in this chunk of stuff right here. Okay, enough about that. Okay, so when you've been designing your resume, it's just kind of grown and grown and grown and grown, right? Honestly, as I've said before, that's not how websites really get designed. You might begin with wireframing, and you can learn more about wireframing from these links here, which I'm not going to go into, but I suggest that you may want to. The idea is we plan out the user experience, we sketch out how things might look, we create prototypes, we use keywords and ideas throughout, and we try to build an experience. And we put things, we have roles attached to things about the job that they are doing before we even get to the point of working in HTML and CSS. We might be doing this sketching on paper, we might be doing pasting things up, we might be doing in Photoshop or InDesign or things. So we're looking at lots of visual things, but lots more important to us is the structure behind it, and that's where wireframing comes in. So we kind of build around all this stuff and then build the HTML and CSS later on from prototype stages. Just briefly wanted to mention that is how websites are really worked on. Okay, and another thing you can think about when you think about design, you can think about design trends, and you could use this link to bring up a bunch of web design trends, or you can go to some of these links. So for instance, web design trends for 2001. Every year, there's lots of different articles written about what are the web design trends for that year. And interestingly, more complex animations, which are stuff that we're not able to do in this class, is something that's definitely happening. And these parallax animations and more complex parallax animations, these are animations where different groups of things are moving at different speeds, depending on if they're in the foreground or background. All right, on and on. These suggestions of designs are this stuff called neomorphism, which you can read about if you wish. Kind of abstract groupings of things, abstract art compositions is something they suggest. I definitely think that their idea about comfortable colors, I think, will be the case. People want to feel comfortable a little bit more. I also think it's a neat idea that they have that web design for causes. I think that's definitely going to be continue to be a trend. So you can look at any of these articles in this. I won't go through my other links here, but just to say, you should think about trends and go look about what are the trends, and then how are you going to fit into those trends or not. Maybe you work against those trends. That's okay. And finally, about design, it's good to think about the basic structure of your average websites and make sure that those parts of the page are doing the job they're supposed to do. So we take this kind of basic and old-fashioned looking website here, and we break it up into chunks. We have a header, we have a main content area, we have a secondary content area, and we have a footer. Those things all have jobs to do. And even much more modern websites tend to have a lot of these same elements, right? So the feature area, the main content area or feature area, its job is to be attention getting. It might be a big carousel, it might be just a single big piece of art. And the body content area, the secondary content area I would call it, the job is to have lots of links, lots of points of entry, lots of things, other topics represented. The footer, it has its own job. The footer can be small or very large. It might have site maps, lots of links to other parts of the page. It might have all the legalese on it and so on. And the header we didn't get to, but of course it's mostly navigation, its job is. So that idea of breaking up the page into the different basic chunks and determining what the jobs it has to do, and are they doing their jobs, is another way to look at website design. So we've gone through some ideas about how we do layout, and that we're going to be doing much more of it with Flex, and then looking at why we should make design decisions and how you can analyze design a little bit too.